the Nikola Tesla Company. In 1895, Edward Dean Adams, impressed with what he saw when he toured Tesla's lab, agreed to help found the Nikola Tesla Company, set up to fund, develop, and market a variety of previous Tesla patent-signed inventions as well as new ones. Alfred Brown signed on, bringing along patents developed under Peck and Brown. The board was filled out with William Birch Rankine and Charles F. Coney. 125. It found few investors since the mid-1890s were a tough time financially, and the wireless lighting and oscillators patents it was set up to market never panned out. The company handled Tesla's patents for decades to come. Lab fire. In the early morning hours of the 13th of March, 1895, the South Fifth Avenue building that housed Tesla's lab caught fire. It started in the basement of the building and was so intense Tesla's fourth-floor lab burned and collapsed into the second floor. The fire not only set back Tesla's ongoing projects, but it also destroyed a collection of early notes and research material, models, and demonstration pieces, including many that have been exhibited at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Tesla told the New York Times, "I am in tomb of grief to talk. What can I say?" 126. After the fire, Tesla moved to 46 and 48 East Houston Street and rebuilt his lab on the 6th and 7th floors. X-ray experimentation. Starting in 1894, Tesla began investigating what he referred to as radiant energy of invisible kinds after he had noticed damaged film in his laboratory in previous experiments. 127, later identified as Roentgen rays or X-rays. His early experiments were with Crookes tubes, a cold cathode electrical discharge tube. Tesla may have inadvertently captured an X-ray image predating, by a few weeks, Wilhelm Röntgen's December 1895 announcement of the discovery of X-rays when he tried to photograph Mark Twain illuminated by a Geissler tube, an earlier type of gas discharge tube. The only thing captured in the image was the metal locking screw on the camera lens. 128. X-ray Tesla took of his hand in March 1896. After hearing of Röntgen's discovery of X-ray and X-ray imaging, radiography. 129, Tesla proceeded to do his own experiments in X-ray imaging, developing a high-energy single-terminal vacuum tube of his own design that had no target electrode and that worked from the output of the Tesla coil. The modern term for the phenomenon produced by this device is Bremsstrahlung or braking radiation. In his research, Tesla devised several experimental setups to produce X-rays. Tesla held that, with his circuits, the instrument will enable one to generate Roentgen rays of much greater power than obtainable with ordinary apparatus. 130. Tesla noted the hazards of working with his circuit and single-node X-ray producing devices. In his many notes on the early investigation of this phenomenon, he attributed the skin damage to various causes. He believed early on that damage to the skin was not caused by the Roentgen rays, but by the ozone generated in contact with the skin, and to a lesser extent, by nitrous acid. Tesla incorrectly believed that X-rays were longitudinal waves, such as those produced in waves in plasmas. These plasma waves can occur in force-free magnetic fields. 131, 132. On the 11th of July, 1934, the New York Herald Tribune published an article on Tesla, in which he recalled an event that occasionally took place while experimenting with his single electrode vacuum tubes. A minute particle would break off the cathode, pass out of the tube, and physically strike him. Sad smiley. 133. Tesla said he could feel a sharp stinging pain where it entered his body, and again at the place where it passed out. In comparing these particles with the bits of metal projected by his electric gun, Tesla said, "The particles in the beam of force, will travel much faster than such particles, and they will travel in concentrations. Radio remote control. In 1898, Tesla demonstrated a boat that used a cohere-based radio control which he dubbed Telautomaton to the public during an electrical exhibition at Madison Square Garden. 135. Tesla tried to sell his idea to the US military as a type of radio-controlled torpedo, but they showed little interest. 136. Remote radio control remained a novelty until World War I and afterward, when a number of countries used it in military programs. 137. Tesla took the opportunity to further demonstrate teleautomatics in an address to a meeting of the Commercial Club in Chicago, while he was traveling to Colorado Springs, on 13 May 1899. Wireless power. From the 1890s through 1906, Tesla spent a great deal of his time and fortune on a series of projects trying to develop the transmission of electrical power without wires. It was an expansion of his idea of using coils to transmit power that he had been demonstrating in wireless lighting. He saw this as not only a way to transmit large amounts of power around the world but also, as he had pointed out in his earlier lectures, a way to transmit worldwide communications. In 1898, Tesla demonstrated a radio-controlled boat which he hoped to sell as a guided torpedo to navies around the world. 134. Tesla sitting in front of a spiral coil used in his wireless power experiments at his East Houston St. Laboratory. At the time Tesla was formulating his ideas, there was no feasible way to wirelessly transmit communication signals over long distances, let alone large amounts of power. Tesla had studied radio waves early on, and came to the conclusion that part of the existing study on them, by Hertz, waves are correct. 138, 139, 140. Also, this new form of radiation was widely considered at the time to be a short-distance phenomenon that seemed to die out in less than a mile. 141. Tesla noted that, even if Thiessen radio waves were true, they were totally worthless for his intended purposes, since this form of invisible light would diminish over a distance just like any other radiation and would travel in straight lines right out into space, becoming hopeless. 142. By the mid-1890s, Tesla was working on the idea that he might be able to conduct electricity long distance through the Earth or the atmosphere, and began working on experiments to test this idea, including setting up a large resonance transformer magnifying transmitter in his East Houston Street lab. 143, 144, 145. Seeming to borrow from a common idea at the time that the Earth's atmosphere was conductive. 146, 147. He proposed a system composed of balloons suspending, transmitting, and receiving electrodes in the air above 30,000 feet, 9,100 m, in altitude, where heat outflow pressure would allow him to send high voltages, millions of volts, long distances. Colorado Springs. Tesla's Colorado Springs laboratory. To further study the conductive nature of low-pressure air, Tesla set up an experimental station at high altitude in Colorado Springs during 1899. 148, 149, 150, 151. There he could safely operate much larger coils than in the cramped confines of his New York lab, and an associate had made an arrangement for the El Paso Power Company to supply alternating current free of charge. 151. To fund his experiments, he convinced John Jacob Astor IV to invest $100,000, $3,517,600 in today's dollars, 75, to become a majority shareholder in the Nikola Tesla Company. Astor thought he was primarily investing in the new wireless lighting system. Instead, Tesla used the money to fund his Colorado Springs experiments. 152. Upon his arrival, he told reporters that he planned to conduct wireless telegraphy experiments, transmitting signals from Pikes Peak to Paris. 153. There, he conducted experiments with a large coil operating in the megavolts range, producing artificial lightning and thunder, consisting of millions of volts and discharges of up to 135 feet, 41 m, in length, 155, and, at one point, inadvertently burned out the generator in El Paso, causing a power outage. 156. The observations he made of the electronic noise of lightning strikes led him to, incorrectly, conclude, 157, 158, that he could use the entire globe of the Earth to conduct electrical energy. A multiple exposure picture of Tesla sitting next to his magnifying transmitter generating millions of volts. The 7-meter, 23 feet, long arcs were not part of the normal operation but only produced for effect by rapidly cycling the power switch. 154. During his time at his laboratory, Tesla observed unusual signals from his receiver which he speculated to be communications from another planet. He mentioned them in a letter to a reporter in December 1899, 159, and to the Red Cross Society in December 1900. 160, 161. Reporters treated it as a sensational story and jumped to the conclusion Tesla was hearing signals from Mars. 160. He expanded on the signals he heard in the 9th of February 1901 Collier's weekly article entitled Talking with Planets, where he said it had not been immediately apparent to him that he was hearing intelligently controlled signals and that the signals could have come from Mars, Venus, or other planets. 161. It has been hypothesized that he may have intercepted Guglielmo Marconi's European experiments in July 1899. Marconi may have transmitted the letter S. ... in a naval demonstration, the same 3 impulses that Tesla hinted at hearing in Colorado. 161, or signals from another experimenter in wireless transmission. 162. Tesla had an agreement with the editor of the Century magazine to produce an article on his findings. The magazine sent a photographer to Colorado to photograph the work being done there. The article, titled The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, appeared in the June 1900 edition of the magazine. He explained the superiority of the wireless system he envisioned, but the article was more of a lengthy philosophical treatise than an understandable scientific description of his work. 163, illustrated with what were to become iconic images of Tesla and his Colorado Springs experiments. Wardenclyffe. Tesla's Wardenclyffe plant in Long Island in 1904. From this facility, Tesla to demonstrate wireless transmission of electrical energy across the Atlantic. Tesla made the rounds in New York trying to find investors for what he thought would be a viable system of wireless transmission, wining and dining them at the Waldorf Astoria's Palm Garden, the hotel where he was living at the time, the Players Club, and Delmonico's. 164. In March 1901, he obtained $150,000, $5,276,400 in today's dollars, 75, from J.P. Morgan in return for a 51% share of any generated wireless patents, and began planning the Wardenclyffe Tower facility to be built in Shoreham, New York, 100 miles, 161 kilometers, east of the city on the north shore of Long Island. 165. By July 1901, Tesla had expanded his plans to build a more powerful transmitter to leap ahead of Marconi's radio-based system, which Tesla thought was a copy of his own. 160. He approached Morgan to ask for more money to build the larger system, but Morgan refused to supply any further funds. 166. In December 1901, Marconi successfully transmitted the letter S from England to Newfoundland, defeating Tesla in the race to be first to complete such a transmission. A month after Marconi's success, Tesla tried to get Morgan to back an even larger plan to transmit messages and power by controlling vibrations